The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the grounds of Hollow Creek Nursing Home. The sprawling building, once a grand estate, now loomed with an air of forgotten elegance and hidden secrets. Its ivy-covered walls seemed to whisper tales of bygone eras, and the creaking iron gate stood ajar, inviting and foreboding in equal measure. Emily Mason drove up the winding driveway, her heart a mix of hope and trepidation. Her father, Thomas Mason, sat beside her, gazing out of the window with a distant, resigned look. Hollow Creek was to be his new home, a place where he could receive the care he needed. Emily prayed it would be a place where he could find some peace. As they parked, a nurse in a crisp white uniform approached, her smile warm but her eyes betraying a flicker of something else, perhaps caution. "Welcome to Hollow Creek," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Nurse Julia. You must be Mr. Mason, and you must be Emily. We've been expecting you." Emily shook her hand, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach. "Thank you. It's a beautiful place." Nurse Julia nodded. "It is. Let's get you both inside and settled." The entrance hall was grand, with high ceilings and ornate chandeliers, but there was a chill in the air that made Emily shiver. As they walked through the hallways, the sounds of the residents, some chatting, some watching TV, others in quiet contemplation, filled the space. But there was an undercurrent of something else, something that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand on end. Nurse Julia led them to a cozy room on the second floor. "This will be your room, Mr. Mason. If you need anything, just press the call button by the bed." Thomas nodded absently, his eyes already wandering around the room. Emily helped him settle in, arranging his belongings and making sure he was comfortable. "I'll be back tomorrow, Dad," she said, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "If you need anything, just call me." Thomas smiled faintly. "I'll be fine, Emily. Don't worry about me." As Emily left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She turned quickly, catching a glimpse of a shadow flitting across the hallway. But when she looked again, there was nothing there. She shook her head, blaming her overactive imagination. It was just a new place, a new environment. Everything would be fine. The day turned to evening, and the nursing home quieted down. Emily returned to her apartment, but sleep did not come easily. Her dreams were filled with dark corridors and ghostly whispers, and she woke several times, her heart pounding. Back at Hollow Creek, the night shift had begun. Nurse Julia made her rounds, checking on the residents. As she passed Mr. Mason's room, she paused. The door was slightly ajar, and she heard a faint, murmuring voice. She pushed the door open gently. Thomas was sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room, where shadows seemed to dance and flicker. He was talking softly, his voice filled with a strange mixture of fear and familiarity. Nurse Julia stepped into the room. "Mr. Mason, are you all right?" Thomas turned to her, his eyes wide and glassy. "Do you see them, nurse? The people in the shadows. They've come to visit me." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. "There's no one there, Mr. Mason. It's just the shadows." But as she spoke, the shadows seemed to deepen, and a cold breeze swept through the room. Julia took a step back, her pulse quickening. "Rest now, Mr. Mason," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's just your imagination." Thomas lay back down, but his eyes never left the corner of the room. As Julia left, she couldn't help but glance back, half expecting to see something lurking in the darkness. Outside, the wind howled, and the trees rustled ominously. Hollow Creek Nursing Home stood silent and imposing, a place where the past lingered and the present trembled under its weight. And as the night deepened, the spirits of those who had once called it home began to stir, eager to tell their stories to anyone who would listen. The days that followed Emily's father's arrival at Hollow Creek were filled with an increasing sense of unease. The nursing home's staff went about their duties with practiced smiles, but behind their eyes lurked shadows of their own. The residents, some of whom had been there for years, whispered among themselves, their conversations trailing off whenever staff approached. Emily visited her father daily, each visit a blend of reassurance and growing concern. Thomas seemed to be adjusting, but there was a distant look in his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. He spoke of strange dreams and feelings of being watched, dismissing them as the byproducts of old age and medication. One afternoon, as Emily walked through the dimly lit corridors, she overheard a conversation between two nurses. "I swear, I heard it again last night," one of them said, her voice a hushed whisper. "A child's laughter, coming from the basement." The other nurse shivered. "We're not supposed to talk about it. You know what happened to Maria when she asked too many questions." Emily's curiosity was piqued, but she knew better than to intervene. Instead, she made a mental note to be more observant. That night, as she tucked her father into bed, he grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Emily, promise me you'll be careful," he said, his voice urgent. "There's something not right about this place." Emily squeezed his hand, trying to offer comfort. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll be fine. Just get some rest." After leaving her father's room, Emily decided to take a walk around the grounds. The moon cast an eerie glow over the nursing home, its light filtering through the dense trees that surrounded the property. As she wandered, she felt a chill in the air, and the sensation of being watched returned, stronger than ever. She turned a corner and found herself near the old chapel, a small, decrepit building that had long since fallen into disuse. Its windows were cracked, and the door hung slightly ajar. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and dread, Emily stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Moonlight streamed through the broken windows, casting strange shadows on the walls. As she moved deeper into the chapel, she noticed a small door at the back, partially hidden by an old, moth-eaten curtain. Pushing the door open, she found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest as she descended, the stairs creaking beneath her weight. At the bottom, she discovered a small, dimly lit room, its walls lined with old, yellowed medical records and photographs. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she examined the photographs. They depicted former residents, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and pain. Among them, she recognized some of the current residents, looking much younger but unmistakably themselves. Her hand shook as she picked up one of the medical records. The entries were disturbing, detailing experimental treatments and unexplained deaths. A sense of horror washed over her as she realized the full extent of the nursing home's dark past. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the lone candle that had provided the only light. Emily's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to find her way back to the stairs. But as she turned, she saw a figure standing at the bottom of the staircase, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes. Frozen with fear, Emily could only watch as the figure slowly advanced, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. She stumbled backward, her phone slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. In the pitch darkness, Emily felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She screamed, the sound echoing through the chapel and out into the night. Summoning all her strength, she pushed past the figure and raced up the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She burst out of the chapel and into the cool night air, her heart pounding in her ears. As she ran back to the main building, she could still feel the icy touch of the hand on her arm, a lingering reminder of the horror she had encountered. Back in the safety of her father's room, Emily tried to calm her racing thoughts. She knew she had to find out more about Hollow Creek's past, not just for her father's sake, but for the sake of all the residents. The shadows of the past were reaching out, and she needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. The nights at Hollow Creek were long and restless. Sleep came fitfully to the residents, haunted by shadows and whispers that seemed to intensify as the darkness deepened. Emily's discovery in the chapel had unsettled her deeply, but she tried to keep her fears hidden from her father, not wanting to alarm him further. One particularly cold night, Mrs. Thompson, a longtime resident known for her sweet demeanor and fondness for knitting, lay in her bed staring at the ceiling. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on her nightstand. She had been feeling a growing sense of unease lately, but tonight was different. Tonight, the air felt heavier, oppressive. As she turned over, trying to find a more comfortable position, a soft whispering filled the room. Mrs. Thompson froze, her heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but she couldn't make out the words. She glanced around the room, her eyes wide with fear. The shadows in the corners seemed to writhe and twist, taking on ominous shapes. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and she could see her breath forming in the cold air. A figure began to materialize at the foot of her bed, a spectral presence with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. Mrs. Thompson clutched her blanket, her knuckles white. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure moved closer, its form becoming more defined. It was a woman, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes filled with sorrow. Mrs. Thompson recognized her, Alice, a former resident who had died under mysterious circumstances a year ago. She had always been kind, but now her spirit radiated anguish and anger. "Alice," Mrs. Thompson's voice was barely a whisper. "What do you want?" Alice's ghost reached out a translucent hand, pointing towards the window. Mrs. Thompson turned her head slowly, following the direction of the gesture. The window, which had been closed, was now wide open, the curtains billowing in the cold breeze. "You must help us," Alice's voice echoed in Mrs. Thompson's mind. "We cannot rest." Mrs. Thompson tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer. The shadows danced menacingly, and Alice's figure flickered, then vanished, leaving behind a chilling silence. The next morning, Emily arrived to find Mrs. Thompson in a state of shock. The elderly woman sat in her chair, staring blankly at the wall, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Emily rushed to her side, concern etched on her face. "Mrs. Thompson, are you all right?" Emily asked gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. Mrs. Thompson turned slowly, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here, Emily. The spirits. They're trying to tell us something. We have to listen." Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had heard similar stories from other residents, but this was the first time someone had been so directly affected. She needed to understand what was happening, and she needed to do it quickly. Later that day, Emily sat with her father in his room, her mind racing with thoughts of the encounter. Thomas watched her quietly, sensing her distress. "Something happened, didn't it?" he asked softly. Emily nodded, recounting Mrs. Thompson's experience. "Dad, I think there's more to this place than we know. The residents are seeing things, and I'm starting to believe them." Thomas sighed, his eyes filled with worry. Hollow Creek has a dark history, Emily. It's been here for decades, and many have died within these walls. If the spirits are trying to communicate, there must be a reason. Emily took a deep breath. I need to find out what that reason is, for the sake of everyone here. That night, as Emily prepared to leave, she noticed a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was Nurse Julia, her face pale and drawn. She looked as if she hadn't slept in days. "Nurse Julia, are you all right?" Emily called out. Julia turned slowly, her eyes haunted. "Emily, we need to talk. There's something you need to know about Hollow Creek." The two women found a quiet corner in the lounge, away from prying eyes and ears. Julia's hands shook as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it's haunted, Emily. I've seen things, heard things. The spirits of former patients, they can't find peace. They died under terrible conditions and their anguish lingers." Emily listened intently, her heart heavy with dread. "What happened to them?" Julia's eyes filled with tears. "Neglect, abuse, experiments that went horribly wrong. The previous management covered it all up, but the spirits remember. They want justice, and they won't rest until they get it." Emily's resolve hardened. She knew what she had to do. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The spirits of Hollow Creek were counting on her, and she would not let them down. The morning sun cast long, eerie shadows across the grounds of Hollow Creek Nursing Home. Emily sat in her car, parked at the far end of the lot, her mind racing with the revelations from Nurse Julia. The stories of abuse, neglect, and mysterious deaths weighed heavily on her heart. She knew she had to dig deeper to uncover the full extent of the nursing home's dark past. Her first step was the local library. Emily spent hours combing through old newspapers, historical records, and archived documents. The further back she went, the more she uncovered about Hollow Creek's troubled history. The nursing home had changed hands multiple times over the decades, each transition marked by rumors of malpractice and tragedy. One particular article from 20 years ago caught her eye. It detailed the death of a patient named Margaret Wilkins, who had died under suspicious circumstances. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as natural causes, but the article hinted at foul play. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she read about the testimony of other residents who spoke of strange experiments conducted in secret during the night. With this newfound information, Emily decided to visit the county records office. She requested access to any legal documents related to Hollow Creek, including lawsuits and complaints. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with a sympathetic smile, handed her a thick file. "This place has quite a history," the clerk said. "You're not the first to ask about it, you know." Emily thanked her and found a quiet corner to read through the documents. The file was filled with damning evidence, complaints from families, lawsuits filed by former employees, and internal memos that spoke of cover-ups and shady dealings. The most shocking document was a series of reports detailing unethical experiments conducted on the residents, all in the name of medical advancement. As she read, Emily's anger grew. How could so much suffering have been ignored, swept under the rug? She felt a renewed sense of determination to bring these horrors to light and to help the spirits of Hollow Creek find peace. Later that evening, Emily returned to the nursing home. She found Nurse Julia in the staff lounge, looking exhausted but resolute. Emily shared what she had discovered, watching as Julia's face grew pale. "We need to do something," Julia said, her voice trembling. "We can't let this continue." Together, they devised a plan. They would gather more evidence, interview the remaining residents, and document their experiences. Emily would contact the families of the deceased patients, hoping to find allies who would join their cause. They needed to bring the truth to the authorities and ensure that Hollow Creek was shut down for good. That night, as Emily walked through the halls, she felt a strange sense of purpose. The spirits seemed to be watching her, their presence more palpable than ever. She could almost hear their whispers of encouragement, urging her to keep going. In her father's room, Thomas greeted her with a tired smile. "You look determined," he said, his eyes twinkling with pride. "I am, Dad," Emily replied. "I've found out so much. There's no turning back now." Thomas reached out and took her hand. "Be careful, Emily. This place holds many secrets, and not all of them want to be uncovered." Emily squeezed his hand, feeling a surge of love and determination. "I will, Dad. I promise." As she left his room, she noticed a figure standing in the shadows at the end of the hallway. It was Mr. Ellis, a longtime resident with a reputation for being a bit of a recluse. Emily had heard he knew more about Hollow Creek's history than anyone else. She approached him cautiously. "Mr. Ellis, can I talk to you?" He looked up, his eyes sharp and clear. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You want to know about the past, don't you?" Emily nodded. "Yes, I do. I need to understand what happened here." Mr. Ellis motioned for her to follow him. He led her to his room, a small, cluttered space filled with old books and photographs. He pointed to a chair, and Emily sat down, feeling a sense of anticipation. "I've seen a lot in my time here," Mr. Ellis began, his voice filled with a mix of bitterness and sorrow. "I've seen things that would make your skin crawl, but I've also kept records, hidden them away where no one would think to look." He reached under his bed and pulled out a battered old box. Inside were journals, letters, and photographs, pieces of the past that told the true story of Hollow Creek. Emily sifted through the contents, feeling a mixture of horror and fascination. "These are my proof," Mr. Ellis said. "They show what really happened, and they can help you bring justice to those who suffered." Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek as she looked at the evidence. "Thank you, Mr. Ellis. This means more than you know." As she left his room, clutching the box tightly, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The spirits of Hollow Creek were counting on her, and she would not let them down. The darkness that had plagued this place for so long was finally being brought into the light. The following days at Hollow Creek Nursing Home grew increasingly tense. The residents, once accustomed to the odd flicker of lights or the occasional cold spot, now faced a barrage of supernatural occurrences. Emily and Nurse Julia, armed with the damning evidence from Mr. Ellis, worked tirelessly to gather more testimonies and prepare their case. However, the spirits of Hollow Creek seemed to sense the impending revelation of their torment, and their manifestations became more frequent and aggressive. One night, as Emily sat in her father's room, a sudden chill filled the air. Thomas, who had been dozing in his chair, jerked awake, his eyes wide with fear. "They're here, Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're all around us." Emily turned and, to her horror, saw ghostly figures materializing in the room. Faces twisted in agony and despair loomed closer, their hollow eyes fixed on her. She felt a cold hand brush against her arm and shivered violently. "Please," she murmured, her voice shaky. "We're trying to help you. Tell us what you need." One of the spirits, a woman with dark, empty eye sockets, stepped forward. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, images flooded Emily's mind. visions of suffering, of cruel experiments conducted in the dead of night, of bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the chapel. Emily gasped, overwhelmed by the intensity of the visions. She fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she whispered. "We'll make it right, I promise." The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air. The room gradually returned to normal, the oppressive cold lifting. Thomas reached out and placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," he said softly. "They know you're on their side." Emily nodded, wiping her tears. "I just hope it's enough." The next day, Emily and Nurse Julia gathered the residents in the common room. The air was thick with tension, everyone aware of the recent spike in paranormal activity. Emily stood at the front of the room, holding the box of evidence Mr. Ellis had given her. "We all know something is wrong here," she began, her voice strong and steady. "The spirits of former patients are trying to communicate with us. They've shown me their suffering, their torment. They died under terrible conditions, and their spirits cannot rest until we uncover the truth and bring those responsible to justice." A murmur ran through the crowd, a mix of fear and determination. Mr. Ellis stepped forward, his expression grim. "I've lived here longer than most," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of sorrow. "I've seen things I wish I could forget, but we can't ignore this any longer. We need to stand together and fight for the truth." The residents nodded, a sense of solidarity forming among them. Emily continued, outlining their plan to gather more testimonies, document the supernatural occurrences, and prepare a comprehensive report for the authorities. She also mentioned the need to contact the families of former patients, hoping to find more allies in their fight. As the meeting adjourned, the residents dispersed, a newfound sense of purpose in their steps. Emily felt a glimmer of hope. They were making progress, slowly but surely. That night, as Emily and Nurse Julia reviewed the day's findings, a loud crash echoed through the nursing home. They rushed towards the sound, their hearts pounding. It led them to the basement, a place few dared to venture. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old medical equipment and supplies. As they moved deeper into the labyrinthine space, they felt the temperature drop further. The darkness seemed to press in on them, thick and suffocating. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a spectral nurse, her eyes filled with sorrow. She gestured for them to follow. Emily and Julia exchanged a glance, their fear mingling with determination. They followed the ghostly figure to a hidden room at the back of the basement. Inside, they found a gruesome scene: old rusty medical instruments, blood-stained walls, and makeshift beds. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and despair. The ghostly nurse pointed to a stack of old files, her expression imploring. Emily picked up the top file, her hands trembling. It contained detailed reports of the experiments conducted on the patients, horrific procedures that explained the suffering and torment the spirits had shown her. Names, dates, and descriptions filled the pages, a stark record of the cruelty that had been inflicted within these walls. "We have to get this to the authorities," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the proof we need." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "We will, and we'll make sure those responsible are held accountable." As they left the basement, the ghostly nurse faded into the shadows, her presence a silent blessing. Emily and Julia knew they were not alone in their fight. The spirits of Hollow Creek were with them, guiding them towards justice. The darkness had gathered, but the light of truth was beginning to break through, and Emily vowed to see it shine no matter the cost. The evidence Emily and Nurse Julia had gathered was damning, but it wasn't enough on its own. They needed more, more testimonies, more proof of the supernatural occurrences, and most importantly, a way to communicate directly with the spirits to understand their demands fully. Emily knew they couldn't do it alone, so they enlisted the help of Mr. Ellis, whose deep knowledge of Hollow Creek's dark history would be invaluable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the nursing home grounds, Emily, Julia, and Mr. Ellis gathered in the common room. The residents had been informed of the plan and were ready to assist in any way they could. The atmosphere was tense, but resolute. "We need to communicate with the spirits directly," Emily said, her voice steady. "We need to know exactly what they want and how we can help them find peace." Mr. Ellis nodded. "I've seen many attempts to contact the spirits fail, but I believe we can succeed if we approach this with respect and determination." Nurse Julia spread out a collection of candles, crystals, and an old Ouija board she had found in the attic. "We'll use these to create a safe space for the spirits to communicate. We must be open and respectful, no matter what happens." As they prepared, the residents formed a circle around the table, holding hands and closing their eyes. Emily lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. She placed her hands on the Ouija board, her fingers trembling slightly. "We're here to help you," she said softly, addressing the spirits. "Please, tell us what you need." For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, save for the soft crackling of the candles. Then slowly, the planchette began to move. The residents gasped, but Emily remained focused, her eyes fixed on the board. H-E-L-P. The word sent a shiver down her spine. "We want to help you," she said, her voice steady. "Tell us how." The planchette moved again, spelling out words slowly but deliberately. Justice. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "We will bring those responsible to justice," she promised. "But we need more evidence. Please show us what happened." The candles flickered violently, and the room grew colder. The planchette moved again, faster this time, spelling out names, dates, and locations. Pieces of a dark puzzle that Emily and Julia would need to assemble. Suddenly, the candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. A cold wind swept through the room, and the residents clutched each other's hands tightly. Emily felt a presence behind her, a whisper of cold breath on her neck. "They're here," Mr. Ellis murmured. "The spirits are with us." The darkness seemed to pulse with life, and then, just as suddenly as it had descended, it lifted. The candles relit themselves, their flames steady once more. Emily looked around the room, her heart racing. The spirits had given them what they needed. Now it was up to them to act. In the days that followed, Emily, Julia, and Mr. Ellis worked tirelessly to compile the evidence. They documented the supernatural occurrences, collected testimonies from residents, and pieced together the history of the cruel experiments conducted at Hollow Creek. They contacted families of former patients, many of whom had suspected foul play but had never had the proof to back it up. As they gathered more support, the current administration of Hollow Creek grew increasingly nervous. Whispers of an investigation began to circulate, and Emily knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to cover their tracks. They needed to act quickly. One evening, as Emily sat with her father, she told him of their progress. Thomas listened quietly, a look of pride and concern on his face. "You're doing a brave thing, Emily," he said softly. "But be careful. The people who run this place won't go down without a fight." "I know, Dad," Emily replied, squeezing his hand. "But we have to see this through. For you, for all the residents, and for the spirits who can't find peace." Thomas nodded, his eyes shining with tears. "You've always been so strong, Emily. I'm proud of you." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She knew the next steps would be the hardest, confronting the administration and presenting their case to the authorities. But she was ready. They all were. In the early hours of the morning, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Emily felt a presence in her room. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw the ghostly figure of Alice standing by the window. Alice's eyes were filled with sorrow and hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for believing us, for helping us." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We won't let you down. I promise." The figure of Alice slowly faded, leaving behind a sense of peace and determination. Emily knew they were on the right path, and she wouldn't stop until justice was served and the spirits of Hollow Creek could finally rest in peace. The morning dawned gray and cold, casting a somber light over Hollow Creek Nursing Home. Emily, Nurse Julia, and Mr. Ellis gathered in the common room, their hearts heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. They had compiled the evidence and contacted the authorities, but they still needed to understand the full story of the spirit's suffering. Emily had arranged another seance for that evening, hoping to communicate directly with the spirits once more. As the day wore on, the tension in the nursing home grew palpable. The residents sensed the impending confrontation and gathered together, offering support and solidarity. As night fell, Emily, Julia, and Mr. Ellis prepared for the seance in the same dimly lit room. The residents formed a circle around them, their faces etched with determination. The candles were lit, the Ouija board placed in the center of the table, and the atmosphere grew thick with anticipation. Emily took a deep breath and placed her hands on the planchette. "We're here to help you," she said softly. "Please, tell us your story." The planchette moved slowly at first, spelling out fragmented words and phrases. The room grew colder, and the shadows deepened as the spirits began to communicate. CRUELTYNEGLECTEXPERIMENTS. The words sent shivers down Emily's spine. "Please tell us more," she urged. "We need to understand what happened to you." The candles flickered, and the air grew even colder. The planchette moved faster, spelling out a series of names, residents who had died under mysterious circumstances. As the names appeared, the residents in the room whispered among themselves, recognizing friends and loved ones who had passed. The planchette paused, then began to spell out a specific story. The room fell silent as the tale unfolded. MARGARETWILKINS. Margaret Wilkins had been a vibrant woman full of life before she arrived at Hollow Creek, but her time there had been marked by cruelty and neglect. The administration, seeking to cover up their unethical experiments, had silenced her cries for help. She had been subjected to painful treatments, her body and mind broken by the horrors inflicted upon her. As the story continued, the spirits revealed more details: Margaret's attempts to escape, her pleas for mercy, and her eventual death at the hands of those who were supposed to care for her. Emily felt tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the pain and suffering the spirits had endured. The planchette moved again, spelling out another name. ALICE Alice. The ghostly figure who had first appeared to Mrs. Thompson had been a nurse at Hollow Creek. She had discovered the experiments and tried to expose the truth, but she had been silenced, her death staged to look like an accident. Her spirit, bound by guilt and sorrow, had remained at Hollow Creek, hoping for justice. The room was filled with the weight of their stories, the air thick with sorrow and anger. Emily knew they had to act quickly. They had to bring these stories to light and ensure that those responsible were held accountable. "Thank you for sharing your stories," Emily said softly, her voice trembling. "We will not let your suffering be in vain. We will bring justice to Hollow Creek." The candles flickered one last time, and the cold air slowly dissipated. The planchette moved to spell out a final word, THANKYOU. Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. The spirits had shared their stories, and now it was up to them to ensure that their suffering was not forgotten. As the residents dispersed, Emily, Julia, and Mr. Ellis sat together, their hearts heavy with the responsibility they carried. "We need to present this evidence to the authorities immediately," Julia said, her voice firm. "We can't let the administration cover this up any longer." Mr. Ellis nodded. "Agreed. We have everything we need. Now, we just need to make sure it's heard." The next morning, they contacted the local police and the state health department, arranging a meeting to present their findings. As they prepared the final documents, the tension in the nursing home grew. The residents watched anxiously, knowing that the future of Hollow Creek hung in the balance. When the authorities arrived, Emily, Julia, and Mr. Ellis presented their evidence, the documents, the testimonies, the photographs, and the recordings of the supernatural encounters. The officials listened intently, their expressions growing more serious as the presentation went on. By the end, there was no doubt left. The authorities promised a thorough investigation and immediate action to ensure the safety of the residents. Hollow Creek would be shut down, and those responsible for the atrocities would be brought to justice. As the authorities left, Emily felt a sense of relief and triumph. They had done it. They had uncovered the truth and ensured that the spirits of Hollow Creek would finally find peace. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she felt a presence in her room once more. She looked up to see the ghostly figures of Margaret and Alice, their faces serene and grateful. "Thank you," they whispered in unison. "We can finally rest." Emily smiled, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. "Rest in peace," she whispered. "You're free now." The spirit slowly faded, leaving behind a sense of calm and closure. Emily knew that while the battle was over, the memories of those who had suffered at Hollow Creek would live on, a reminder of the importance of justice and compassion. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt the warmth of their gratitude, a gentle embrace that promised a brighter future for all who had been touched by the darkness of Hollow Creek. The day of reckoning had arrived. Hollow Creek Nursing Home buzzed with an undercurrent of nervous energy as Emily, Nurse Julia, and Mr. Ellis prepared for the confrontation with the administration. The residents, aware of the impending showdown, offered their support, their faces a mix of hope and fear. Emily knew that their collective courage and determination would be their greatest strength. The meeting was scheduled for the afternoon. Emily, Julia, and Mr. Ellis gathered their evidence and headed to the administrative wing. As they walked through the dimly lit corridors, Emily felt the weight of the spirit's presence, their silent encouragement bolstering her resolve. The administrator, Mr. Jameson, a stern man with a reputation for ruthlessness, awaited them in his office. He sat behind a large, imposing desk, his eyes cold and calculating. Beside him stood Dr. Lewis, the head physician, whose involvement in the dark experiments was a key piece of their evidence. "What is the meaning of this?" Mr. Jameson demanded as they entered, his tone icy. Emily stepped forward, her voice steady. "We've uncovered evidence of abuse, neglect, and unethical experiments conducted on the residents of Hollow Creek. We have documentation, testimonies, and proof of a cover-up. We demand justice for the victims." Mr. Jameson's expression darkened, and he exchanged a quick glance with Dr. Lewis. "This is outrageous. You have no proof of any wrongdoing." Nurse Julia placed the box of evidence on the desk, her eyes locked on Mr. Jameson. "We have all the proof we need. Detailed records of the experiments, photographs, and witness statements. The authorities are already involved." Mr. Jameson's face contorted with anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about. These patients were receiving cutting-edge treatments. Any allegations of abuse are baseless." Mr. Ellis stepped forward, his voice filled with the weight of years of silence. "I've seen the horrors firsthand. I've watched friends suffer and die because of your so-called treatments. The spirits of those you've wronged are crying out for justice." Dr. Lewis, visibly shaken, tried to interject. "You don't understand. We were under pressure to find results, to make breakthroughs. We didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice," Emily retorted, her voice fierce. "You chose to sacrifice innocent lives for your ambition, and now you'll face the consequences." As the confrontation escalated, the room grew colder and the lights flickered. Emily felt a familiar chill in the air. The spirits were with them, their presence growing stronger. The candles on the desk flickered violently, and a cold wind swept through the room. Mr. Jameson's eyes widened in fear as he glanced around, sensing the supernatural presence. "What is this? What's happening?" Emily stood tall, her voice unwavering. "The spirits of Hollow Creek are here. They demand justice, and they will not be silenced any longer." The shadows in the room deepened and ghostly figures began to materialize. Margaret Wilkins, Alice, and others appeared, their faces filled with sorrow and determination. They surrounded Mr. Jameson and Dr. Lewis, their presence undeniable. "You cannot escape the truth," Margaret's spirit said, her voice echoing with otherworldly power. "We will not rest until justice is served." Mr. Jameson and Dr. Lewis backed away, their faces pale with terror. "This is madness," Mr. Jameson cried out. "You can't do this." "We already have," Emily replied, her voice cold. "The authorities are on their way. You will be held accountable for your crimes." As if on cue, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached. The spirits slowly faded, their presence lingering as a reminder of the justice they sought. Emily, Julia, and Mr. Ellis watched as the police and state investigators arrived, their expressions grim and determined. The investigators moved quickly, taking statements and gathering evidence. Mr. Jameson and Dr. Lewis were placed under arrest, their protests falling on deaf ears. The residents watched from a distance, their faces filled with a mix of relief and vindication. Emily felt a sense of profound satisfaction as she watched the scene unfold. The truth had finally come to light, and the spirits of Hollow Creek would soon find the peace they deserved. She turned to Mr. Ellis and Julia, their faces reflecting the same sense of closure. "We did it," Julia said softly, her eyes shining with tears. "We finally did it." Mr. Ellis nodded, his expression one of quiet triumph. "Justice has been served. The spirits can rest now." As the authorities wrapped up their investigation, the residents of Hollow Creek began to disperse. their spirits lifted by the knowledge that the darkness that had plagued their home was finally being driven out. Emily walked back to her father's room, her heart light with the promise of a brighter future. Thomas looked up as she entered, a smile spreading across his face. "I heard what happened. I'm so proud of you, Emily." Emily sat beside him, taking his hand. "It's over, Dad. They're finally going to pay for what they did. The spirits can rest now." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You've done something incredible, Emily. You've given them the justice they deserved." As night fell over Hollow Creek, the nursing home seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The shadows that had once haunted its halls were receding, replaced by a sense of peace and hope. The residents, both living and departed, could finally find solace in the knowledge that the truth had been revealed and justice had prevailed. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of activity to Hollow Creek Nursing Home. Investigators combed through every corner of the facility, unearthing more evidence of the atrocities committed within its walls. The media descended upon the nursing home, their cameras and microphones capturing the tragic story of the residents and the heroic efforts of Emily, Nurse Julia, and Mr. Ellis. The nursing home was officially shut down, and the residents were relocated to other facilities where they could receive proper care and support. Emily, Nurse Julia, and Mr. Ellis were hailed as heroes, their names synonymous with justice and courage. As the dust began to settle, Emily felt a sense of closure, but also a lingering sadness. Hollow Creek had been a place of unimaginable suffering, but it had also been a home to many who now had to leave behind the memories of friends and loved ones. She knew that the spirits of those who had suffered still needed to be laid to rest properly. One crisp autumn evening, Emily, Julia, and Mr. Ellis returned to the now abandoned nursing home. They were joined by several former residents and family members of those who had passed away. Together, they had planned a memorial ceremony to honor the victims and help their spirits find peace. The group gathered in the old chapel, its broken windows and crumbling walls a stark reminder of the past. Candles were lit, casting a warm glow that contrasted with the chill in the air. Emily stood at the front, holding a small box filled with personal items that had belonged to the deceased residents, photographs, letters, and small keepsakes that carried their memories. "We're here to honor those who suffered and died within these walls," Emily began, her voice steady. "We're here to give them the peace they deserve and to ensure that their stories are never forgotten." Nurse Julia and Mr. Ellis stepped forward, each holding a candle. They placed the candles on the altar, their flames flickering gently. The group joined hands, forming a circle of unity and support. As Emily spoke the names of the victims, the air grew heavy with emotion. Tears were shed, and quiet murmurs of remembrance filled the chapel. The candle's light seemed to grow brighter, as if the spirits were acknowledging their presence. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a soft breeze swept through the chapel. Emily felt a familiar chill and looked up to see the ghostly figures of Margaret Wilkins, Alice, and other former residents. Their faces, once twisted with pain and sorrow, now held expressions of gratitude and peace. "Thank you," Margaret's spirit whispered, her voice echoing softly. "Thank you for giving us justice and for remembering us." Alice stepped forward, her translucent form glowing softly. "We can finally rest," she said, her eyes meeting Emily's. "You've given us what we needed." Emily felt tears stream down her face, but they were tears of relief and joy. "You're free now," she whispered. Rest in peace." The spirits slowly began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air. The candles flickered gently, their flames steady and bright. Emily knew that the spirits had found the peace they had long sought. As the ceremony concluded, the group left the chapel, their hearts lighter. The old building stood silent and empty, but it no longer felt haunted. The shadows of the past had been lifted, and the spirits had finally found their rest. Outside, the moon cast a gentle light over the grounds, and the night was filled with a sense of calm. Emily stood with Julia and Mr. Ellis, looking back at the nursing home one last time. "We did it," Julia said softly, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "We gave them peace." Mr. Ellis nodded, his face serene. "And we ensured that their stories will never be forgotten. That's all we could have hoped for." Emily took a deep breath, feeling a sense of completion. "It's time to move forward," she said, her voice filled with determination. "But we'll carry their memories with us, always." As they walked away from Hollow Creek, the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land. The nursing home, once a place of darkness and despair, now stood as a testament to the power of truth, justice, and compassion. The spirits had found their final rest, and the living could move forward with a renewed sense of hope and purpose.